Hi, it's unusual just to hear me straight away. I'm just doing a little intro before the intro for this episode for two reasons. One is two-thirds of the way through, Ed's audio cuts out. He was doing the podcast with us from abroad, and his audio simply disappeared two-thirds of the way through, and it just dropped off with no rhyme nor reason, a little bit like the ending of the Book of Mark, and or at least in some views. And then the other reason is that we have two great guests, John and Josh, who've been on before, and they are going to talk about something that relates to a previous episode we did. We did an episode with Jonathan McLatchie on something called undesigned coincidences. We're going to talk a little bit about that again, but also about the bigger picture of the group that are behind that sort of revival movement, an apologetics group called headed up by Tim and Lydia McGrew, as well as Jonathan McLatchie and some others. And Josh and John are very, very familiar with their work, and I am a little bit, and we will be delving into that. And so, just to give you a little head start, welcome to this episode.
Hello and welcome to Doubts Aloud. My name is John Nelson. We've got with us Josh Parikh, Francis, Andrew, and Ed, your usual hosts. But as usual, Doubts Aloud has been hijacked again, and we're going to be discussing a phenomenon which Josh has actually coined, called McGrewvianism. Josh, do you want to unpack what McGrewvianism is?
Yeah, no, let's. So I think McGrewvianism, to me, is the intellectual movement formed by Tim and Lydia McGrew. They have a number of prominent acolytes. So the most prominent would probably be Jonathan McLatchie, Eric Manning, David Pullman. I think the kind of key features of this intellectually are, one, they would argue for the maximal reliability of the Gospels and Acts in particular. And that is drawing on their familiarity with historical apologetics from the kind of 16th to the 19th centuries and their expertise in formal epistemology. I think that McGrewvians thoroughly reject the methods and conclusions of New Testament studies in particular, but probably also biblical studies. And they would say that these are faced with serious epistemic pathologies, and they would accept at most a handful of errors in the Bible. And they are not inerrantists, but they are extremely close to the inerrantist in the level of their conservatism, of their Christianity. In some ways, they'd be more conservative than the inerrantist.
Okay. Wow. Okay. And just to make sure that anybody is listening, so John and Josh are professing Christians. So you've been accused of being. Is that not right? So
yes. Yeah. No. John and I are Christians. Yeah. So
okay. So this is a little tiny movement that you've coined, Josh, and so it touches into those particular aspects. So yeah, let's launch.
Well, can you first tell us sort of who they were before they were McGrewvians, in terms of do they have a academic life or
yes, no, absolutely. So Tim McGrew, his background for about 20 years as a philosopher. I think he's long been a conservative Christian, but in his academic expertise, he has long been a professional epistemologist. And epistemology is the study of the theory of knowledge. He is also widely published in the history of science and the philosophy of science. And Tim is published in the British Journal of the Philosophy of Science. He has published on confirmation theory. He has published on Gettier problems. He has published jointly with Lydia. Lydia did a PhD in English literature, but she has since widely published in formal epistemology. I think, and they have published multiple books, articles in this subject. They came to this subject from about 2003 onwards. 2003, they published a response to Alvin Plantinga, who published a critique of the historical argument for the resurrection. And Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher, and Tim and Lydia wrote two response papers to that. Since then, they wrote an article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, and which was arguing for the resurrection. And from there, they have published widely. There are videos. There's an 8-part lecture series from Tim. Lydia has published 4 books at this point. There are lots of blog articles. There's kind of hundreds of blog articles on Lydia's blog. There's videos, there's podcasts. There's so much material at this point, and much material from their acolytes as well.
Yeah. And they are husband and wife, not mother and son.
Yes,
Or son and mother.
that's useful to clarify. Yes, no, they are husband and wife. That's correct.
And I gather,
yes.
Josh, you got quite deep into this from a very supportive journey at the beginning.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, John and I come on at this from kind of different perspectives, but John can say a bit as well. But from my part, I was a dedicated fan of the McGrews for a long period of time. So I read their books, analyzed their papers, watched their videos, and I mean, there's copious proof. You can see the extensive annotations on my Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. You can see the list of citations in kind of papers and articles that I've written on that. Through a range of influences, including multiple conversations with John, I changed my mind about that. And I've come to believe that the McGrews and their acolytes are significantly mistaken. And so there was one point I kind of evolved on this over time, and John and I had conversations. I remember one conversation in Cafe Nero where I said to John, I'd like to combine the ideas of Dale Allison and Lydia McGrew. And I think John kind of came back to me and he said, "Oh, those are two quite different people, Josh. I'm not sure you're going to be able to combine those." Yeah. And he was right. So Dale has won out, I'm afraid. But interesting. I guess John or anyone else, your familiarity with McGrewvianism as a whole. So no.
No, my history with McGrewvianism is probably less prestigious than yours, Josh. Sure. It's I think I came to it through undesigned coincidences, and I think Andy, you actually introduced me to undesigned coincidences, or maybe we just both sort of come across them independently.
That's a bit like talking about the Gospels itself, isn't it?
Well, indeed.
Is it dependence or independence?
We had a shared source which was called not Q but Hidden in Plain View. I think right. Hidden in Plain Sight, or Hidden in Plain View, in view, which looks at the ways in which the Gospels sort of dovetail and interlock in a way that seemingly points towards their veracity. And then I wrote a blog post on that on Medium. I've subsequently sort of reposted it on my website, which is www.behindthegospels.com. Anyone
and link will be provided.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah. And that review had that post had an editor par excellence in Josh. So we sort of did a little bit of work on that together, but all errors are my own. So it's really through that I think I've read through the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology and just seen a lot online. I think we've also got to mention Eric Manning and the Testify YouTube channel in this regard, because it's really well-produced content that sort of popularizes a lot of McGrew's ideas, or the McGrew's ideas. And they often have the McGrews on their channel and that sort of thing. So Testify may be the way that most sort of popular Christians know about McGrew's ideas, but also the channel that brought us all together, Unbelievable, sort of regularly features Lydia McGrew and sometimes Timothy McGrew, and also Capturing Christianity is another channel as well. And this sort of
Vision.
And Myth Vision, I suppose Myth Vision, responding to the McGrews.
Responding to the McGrews,
yeah, indeed.
I remember a conversation with you. Oh, sorry, Ed. I do remember that conversation with me, you, and Jonathan McLatchie in a cafe.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Oh, right. Did you spill any coffee? Was it busy?
Well, John, if I remember back then, I think you were very, you were actually with him in a way, looking at contradictions in the Bible. And it was me. It was a little bit about me against both of you, except it was like a very cantankerous in one sense, and then it was all very I don't know, it was very interesting discussion, but it looks like you've moved on since then.
So I studied my undergrad in biblical studies and theology at the University of Nottingham, which was a kind of, I would say, the last real academic bastion of evangelical academic scholarship was sort of taking place there. Right. And I actually looked at the problem of the dating of Jesus' death and the discrepancy between John and the synoptics. So I've sort of had as part of my dissertation, so I've had a sort of long-standing interest, if not in McGrewvianism, then in kind of harmonization and how can we reconcile these differences in the Gospels, sort of coming from, I suppose, a more evangelical standpoint. and I'm not sure how I describe myself now, but maybe a sort of more Peter Enns type approach. Or I suppose a neo-orthodox approach to scripture, sort of recognizing its humanity, but also how through its humanity it also speaks to us as Christians.
A Lewisian approach, I think.
A Lewisian, yes, yeah, quite possibly. Lewis doesn't quite go neo-orthodox, but Lewis talks about how the Gospels how Scripture does contain naivety, error, and contradiction, and how it's an untidy vehicle for the divine revelation, and yet it also carries the Word of God.
That's like Peter Enns, definitely.
I quite like that sort of Lewisian approach. Yes.
Yeah. Can just before we get too deep, can I put them on the map a bit of apologetics? Because you get people who are out and out apologists who don't claim to be sort of in scholarship, like say the McDowells. And then you have conservative scholars who are out and out scholars, and apologists tend to quote them more than they are apologists themselves. So that would be people like maybe Bloomberg.
Craig Blomberg, yeah.
Yes, and there's someone called Metzler, the name we hear a lot, and Craig Evans, Richard Borkham. You won't see them being apologists, but they're being used by apologists as source evidence material. So how do the McGrews fit in all that kind of pantheon of characters?
Well, so there's a fascinating relationship with evangelical scholarship and the McGrews. So I think that the McGrews would not are very happy with being called apologists. The Tim McGrew has an apologetics reading list on. He's been on apologetics websites. He's like Lydia. I think Testimonies to the Truth, I think, is undoubtedly a work of apologetics. They are scholars. I mean, they are absolutely published scholars, and I absolutely don't want to take away from that in anything that we say. Their publication on New Testament studies may be something else to discuss, but they are published studies in scholars. Their relationship
in epistemology.
That's
a kind of day job, and this is more their hobby.
I mean, it's a little bit complicated, but yes, their relationship with evangelical scholars, they are big fans of a lot of evangelical scholars. Craig Blomberg, you mentioned, Lydia loves the book on the historical reliability of John. They love Richard Borkham. She has a very glowing review of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and they rely heavily on his argument from kind of names, and kind of name frequencies. One of the very interesting parts is that their primary opponents in two of Lydia's books are not actually non-Christian scholars. It is evangelical scholars who are the primary opponents in The Eye of the Beholder and The Mirror or the Mosque. Mike Licona, Craig Evans, Craig Keener. These are the ones that they think are the kind of the real enemies, and it's one of the factors that I think speaks to a lack of engagement with apologetics or with scholarship as a whole. Is the fact that these are the real enemies in this. But yes,
didn't Craig Keener do the foreword for their book though?
Craig Keener did a foreword. Craig Keener did do a foreword for Hidden in Plain View, as did Jane Warner Wallace. But since then, Lydia read his commentary on the Gospel of John, and he makes comments like John took significant liberties with the facts, and that kind of thing. And Lydia is not happy about this because we need the Gospels we need to know that the words that Jesus said are the actual words that he said. Exactly. So yes, Craig Keener, for all of his, he is the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. Licona has one of the most important books defending the resurrection out there. But they're some of the primary enemies, actually, of McGrewvianism, interestingly.
Wow.
So, yes.
Wow, yeah. So you don't even need the bart-ehrmans and other people.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, we might want to mention here that the reason why these scholars are disliked is that they take a sort of very different methodology to the McGrews. When the McGrews go about arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, they take what they call and by the way, the McGrews, they are brilliant at coining terms which can catch on in the apologetics community. Josh, you made that point to me. That's one of yours, but I think it's so true. They coined what is termed the maximal data approach. So I think they rightly actually point out that the minimal facts approach to the resurrection, which is we're going to take 3 or 4 facts relating to the resurrection and then try to explain them using the hypothesis that God raised Jesus bodily from the dead. That doesn't actually do what it says on the tin, and that actually we need a more robust approach, and their approach is called the maximal data approach. So this is that the Gospels are historically reliable sources through and through, and that is why we can trust that their accounts of Jesus' resurrection are completely historically reliable, is actually what went down in history. So that's sort of one of the differences between their approach and many of the other scholars that we've already mentioned, is that they want to argue for the thoroughgoing reliability of the Gospels as a whole.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah,
agreed.
And as more like eyewitness testimonies that just have different eyewitness testimonies, but nothing. So it seems like it's all prior to scholarship, really. I think you said, one of you said, yeah.
Should I? Why not? In terms of, I think the problem that we have when we come to what the McGrews are doing, I think the confusion that if you're a layperson, I think that you have, on the one hand, I've just laid out they are highly credentialed, published philosophers. They seem to offer a barrage of arguments on their behalf. So undesigned coincidences, external confirmations, the traditional authorship of the Gospels. They have a huge range of publications and they have enormous intellectual energy on this. So that seems pretty convincing on the one hand. On the other hand, I think increasingly New Testament scholars have seen what the McGrews are doing and are basically horrified. So the kinds of comments that you get, kind of James McGraw kind of responded on Twitter to McLatchie, one of Lydia's videos, and kind of called it embarrassing, I think. Laura Robinson, again, a kind of well-known New Testament scholar, has said there is no McGrewvian hypothesis in New Testament studies. It's just not a thing. Matthew Harkey, who absolutely knows his stuff in New Testament studies, has kind of compared it to mythicism. So I think it's quite a confusing problem, because you have on the one hand these kind of two things, and you don't really know where to go if you're not familiar with the detailed literature on this. And I think that the McGrewvian answer to this is to say, well, actually, New Testament studies, the methods are crap. The methods that they have serious epistemic pathologies, is the direct quote that I've got. And that's because they don't read the sources, they're not open to harmonization, they haven't engaged the historical literature on this topic from kind of the 16th to the 19th century, they're not familiar with epistemology, and we're familiar with epistemology, and actually they just don't get what they're talking about. So what you need to do is, from our outsider perspective and from our expertise, we know what it is like to make an argument, and therefore you should trust us instead of trusting all of these New Testament scholars. So I think that's the argument. So I think where the problem with that is that I don't think that's the right take on why they disagree with scholarship. And maybe I'll stop at that point. I can go on, but yeah.
John?
Yes, I'm trying to work out how to slice and dice this. So we could have one of their big beefs, and talk about it in detail, and then pick up another one and talk about that in detail. Or we could try and sort of skate over everything.
Well, yeah, okay. I'll just before that, I just wanted to sum up what you both had said then, just for the listeners. So what you're basically saying, that the Tim and Lydia McGrew are sort of evangelicals who have sort of, in a sense, spearheaded a movement of defending the reliability of the Bible in ways that actually fit pre-New Testament studies on the New Testament by scholars in the mainstream and even evangelicals in that regard, and that they're sort of, in a sense, putting down roots before that happened to say that that's gone all off track. All of the stuff that even we've talked about on this podcast about the New Testament, we need to wind back and get back to this sort of sort of 19th century way of thinking about the text as eyewitness testimony.
I think that's a reasonable summary. I think that they would say that New Testament studies has kind of gone off track since Strauss, maybe. I mean, I don't know that they would say a time, but like New Testament studies went off track. They got too worried about the synoptic problem. And people forgot about all of these arguments. So these are kind of, they talk about hidden gems, for example. So they forgot or the arguments of undesigned coincidences. They forgot Stanley Liathes and his arguments for the consistency of character across Gospels. So I think they would say that people forgot. I don't think they have a particularly specific hypothesis of what went wrong. But I think that they would say that things went wrong and that we need to get it back on track. So yeah.
Okay. For picking up what you just said there, John, could you just outline for any listener what that you just referenced that people were getting bogged down with the synoptic problem? Could you just outline very simply what that is?
So the synoptic problem, or I think they like to refer to it sometimes as the synoptic puzzle, is the puzzle of the literary relationship between the Gospels, because Mark and Matthew and Luke, which are called synopsis to see together, share an enormous amount of information. So the question is, why do they share all of this material? So just to give you an example of this, 600 of Mark's verses appear, many of them verbatim, in Matthew's Gospel. So someone is editing someone else. Here, they're not merely relying upon their memory, they're actually copying out a written source. And it seems like the best solution to most New Testament scholars is that Mark was the first gospel to be written. And that's quite, as that's called that thesis is called Markan priority. It's quite, I suppose, a shocking departure from what the early church thought, because people like Augustine believed that Matthew was the first gospel to be written and then was abbreviated by Mark. But the consensus of New Testament studies across the board, across ideological lines, is that Mark wrote first, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source and also supplemented this with other material which they share, but which they use independently. And that source material is often referred to as Q from the German Quelle, which just means source. The Germans weren't so inventive there. So that's the general solution. And increasingly, scholars also think that John was also reliant upon one or more of the synoptic gospels. It's often proposed Mark and also perhaps Luke as well. So that's the sort of general solution to the synoptic problem, and a little brief comment on how John fits into that as well.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Sets up, particularly with the latest information of now John. Mark Goodacre is doing a book or done one on this, knew the Gospels. And this is, I find that this was, I'd have to say, when I heard of certain aspects of the McGrews way back at that time we were talking about, John, I immediately thought, hang around, they don't seem to be talking about this. They seem to be just jumping into this sort of interlocking Gospels of eyewitness with no reference to what you just said. And I thought that was my first red flag. Why didn't they say up front, oh, by the way, they all interrelate and copy like this, but we're still going to go for this interlocking. But I've noticed that they don't really push it, particularly when Jonathan McLatchie came to our meeting. He didn't tell the audience what you just said. He just launched straight into the eyewitness aspects,
Well, I think that's an important thing to note insofar as they are approaching the text as apologists. So they are not approaching the text as historical sources. They are not, for example, dedicating all of their intellectual energy to asking the question, how does Mark relate to Matthew and Luke literarily? They're just not asking that question. They come to the text with certain things that they want to find, like undesigned coincidences, like I think it's unexplained illusions, and so on. And then inevitably they do find those, but they're not doing the much harder work that I think historical Jesus scholars are doing, textual critics are doing, and so on. They're not actually qualified to be doing that work.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. I think so. It's a useful point, because I think, what are they doing? So I think John makes a really good point here about what are they doing. They are, when we talk about the quest for this, the historical Jesus scholars say that there is a discrepancy between the Christ of faith and the Christ of history. So we have these gospels, and there's a mixture going on, and the McGrews want to reject that. Now, I think the reason they want to reject that, they say that it's just because they've examined the evidence in great detail. I think the reason that they disagree with that is because their scholarship is driven more by their existing commitments than they actually realize. I think the point that is really important here is that actually they are not coming to this as a blank slate. they are coming to this as highly conservative Christians. So I think it's like worth just kind of stepping back. So when we talk about people having biases, I mean, we all have biases. Confirmation bias is a well-known point across the board. So Dale Allison has a lovely section in one of his books talking about how historical Jesus research is really difficult because everyone seems to create Jesus in their own image. It's a real problem in philosophy of religion. It's a real problem in apologetics. So when you make that kind of claim, I'm not making anything particularly distinctive in one way, but in the other way, I think there is something different about the kind of intensity and the specificity of the commitments that they have. I've got a few quotes here, so it's just worth being aware of some of the explicit statements that the McGrews have. So if you read the blog description on What's Wrong with the World, which is Lydia's joint blog, but it's a blog that she published at for years. It starts off by saying, "What's Wrong with the World is dedicated to the defense of what remains of Christendom, the civilization made by the men of the cross of Christ. Athwart to hostile powers we stand, the jihad and liberalism. And we are happy warriors, for our defense is motivated primarily by gratitude for what our ancestors bequeathed to us." So I think it's an interesting quote. It's a notable comment in we have a strong commitment to Christendom. We are defending that. We are standing hostile to two powers, jihad and liberalism. I think you get similar comments elsewhere. Here's a comment from Tim that starts off his lecture series on the Gospels, which is kind of one of the first McGrewvian things. In many cases, what we have given our young people has not been what they need. Bible stories and entertainment and even some devotional thoughts are standard fare in the churches, but they're not being prepared for war. We're sending them out with rubber swords and plastic armor, and it's not enough. So I think that there are many more explicit statements, and we could say much more about the kind of the commitment to the McGrews and the biases that leads to. But I think those are pretty notable comments, and you could absolutely see how having those kind of commitments would skew the kinds of scholarship that you undertake.
Yes, because this is it's the war rhetoric that really struck me from those quotes you just read out.
Yes,
it's because I suppose when you're in a war, you don't necessarily think clearly, you actually you're more likely to put things in binaries and either ors, which I think is also a sort of hallmark of McGrewvianism. I don't know if you want to say anything on that or whether we just...
No, I think that's right. I mean, yeah, I think that's it, that we have binaries here, that we are standing on the side of truth. We have enemies that we are standing against. And that is why that we have to paint people in such hostile terms, which is a kind of well-known feature of this landscape. That's why there's such a lack of engagement and such a reactive attitude. Even when there is engagement, there is a reactive attitude to this is exceedingly poor. This is the quality of this is extremely low. There's a demonization of people as not being proper Christians, etc., etc. So
it reminds me a lot of Richard Carrier.
Yes.
And his rhetoric.
It also reminds me a lot of Ken Ham and his rhetoric.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the young earth creationism stance about others, it's like a war, and the war is also theistic evolutionists. You know what I mean? You're at war with them. And even with you, John, in your studies, or both of you for that matter, I bet you probably didn't think you were at war by learning what you've learned. And,
No, I was raised in an evangelical church, and I was told that theology could be a dangerous enterprise for me because it could lead me away from my faith and so on. But I suppose I approach the question, I approach theology through the lens that all truth is God's truth. And I just want to discover what the truth is. And when I come up against things that I really struggle to believe, that doesn't mean that we have to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can hold on, I think, to a robust Christian faith without we can hold on to that and see the Gospels as possessing, the Gospels in this case, or the Gospels, and then the writings of the Scriptures as possessing a different kind of truth to the sort of what I see as a very modern sense of truth that the McGrews seem to be steeped in. It's not surprising given that most of the writers that they're quoting from are sort of in the very heart of the Enlightenment, where there is raging all these debates around sort of facticity and historicity and so on. But I think that there is an irony here when, a lot of that rhetoric about defending Christendom and so on. And yet, of course, if we want to talk about, the largest church in the world, the Roman Catholic Church, really the heart of Christendom, has accepted a lot of the, has accepted tenets of form criticism in its time, has accepted biblical critical scholarship. So it's really interesting their framing, or even their framing around the Gospel of John being this sort of historically reliable text. That's not what Clement of Alexandria was saying, in the early centuries. I think the early church had much more of an appreciation that John was off sort of forging his own path and was writing a much more sort of spiritual text to complement the Synoptic Gospels. So there's so much there.
Yeah.
So you found yourself a war. Oh, okay, go on in.
Yeah, well, this sort of binary aspect and the kind of mirror image of Tim Carrier. What strikes me is Tim Carrier.
Richard Carrier.
You're
thinking of Tim O'Neill.
You've now blended them. No,
yes,
no. He's thinking of Tim McGrew and Richard.
Oh, okay. Right, yeah.
Anyway, Richard Carrier.
Richard Carrier. Yeah.
Famous mythicist.
Yes, that's right. So they're kind of be opposites, but they both are really keen on Bayes' theorem, I believe. The McGrews, that's where they've come from. He did a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, I think on Bayes, or certainly on epistemology, that was heavy on Bayes.
Can somebody explain Bayes then?
Well, we can if we want to, but the feature of Bayes that I'm going to pick out first is it talks about probabilities. So that's the opposite of a binary approach. It should be a probabilistic approach. So there's something to unpick there. We can talk. I can explain Bayes in a minute, but if you just have in mind that it talks about probabilities, and then I'll move on.
Yeah, I think the thing with the probability side, I think what's interesting is that probabilities is Bayes' theorem is a formula. Bayes' theorem is a mathematical formula, and you could end of how you should judge hypotheses based on evidence. It's actual. What is Bayesian reasoning, which is the type of reasoning that we're talking about, which is about how you update based on evidence. Like, how do you change your view based on evidence? That's tremendously squishy. And is it what actually if we make this slightly more mathematical, what are we actually adding to the discussion? So there's a nice article from a place called Slate Star Codex, and he talks about how Bayesian reasoning is really just kind of doing normal reasoning while kind of muttering under your breath, Bayes, brr, 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 Bayes, brr, brr, brr. Is there anything really that we're doing differently if we kind of make this mathematical? I'm not sure there is. And what you get out with Bayes is what you put in. I will say on the Carrier McGrew front, McGrew definitely knows much more about Bayes than Richard Carrier ever does. And I think that's fair to say. I think in terms of the discrepancies there, but in terms of how the historical method is changed, what you put in is what you get out, and that I think is a pretty critical point. So
I think where Bayes is helpful is that it's sort of popularized this idea of prior probabilities. I think most people now can talk about priors in this discussion, and I think that's one area where I find the McGrews very weak, is that they don't seem to know very much about what is going on in terms of Second Temple Jewish literature, in terms of Greco-Roman literary practice, that sort of provides the background for understanding the Gospels. So they don't seem to have an appreciation of mimesis and what's called imitatio, where it's very common for literary authors to basically copy out and update texts, and there or even just the general sort of license that ancient biographers like the evangelists would have been able to have. I think they do actually reject the understanding of the Gospels as ancient biographies, but this is, it's something that has been borne out by sort of painstaking research by classicists, and I mean it's a sort of a very strange thing to object to, I think.
So are you saying, John, that because of their lack of this background knowledge, their priors are already skewed?
I think so. Yeah. So what they can only explain, for example, as an unexplained illusion or an undesigned coincidence, to refer to an earlier podcast, can sort of just easily be explained by the kind of literary reductive practices which are very common in antiquity. So I think it's they're not properly attending to what could have produced the results or the actual data we find in the Gospels. I think that's going to be a really a big problem, big methodological problem with their work.
Yeah,
it seems to me that there is this parallel with the young Earth creationist movement as well, in the sense that they quite, despite the years of professional work that a geologist has done in his life, whether it's a Christian or not, or a biologist, and they just write them off completely of that academic world in their expertise. And it seems like they're almost just writing off people that have spent their lives just studying one aspect of biblical history or something, or literature, and just dismissing it wholesale. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that, I mean, the things that I think to take the McGrewvian view would be to say they talk about these epistemic pathologies, and they talk about I think the way I'd kind of frame it is that McGrews would say that they have a distinctive and superior methodology to New Testament scholars, and that New Testament scholars don't really know what they're talking about. So, I mean,
yeah.
Sometimes, so the thing is that, again, this is tricky because sometimes that's true and sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's the young Earth creationist. Sometimes there are big problems in fields. There are kind of clear biases in fields. So I think when we have kind of a case of disagreement like this, we have to kind of resolve it in some way. So we say, again, we've got two loads of scholars over here. How do we know who's right? So I think one of the things that you can point to is the fact that it doesn't seem like they've read as much scholarship and engaged the field in as much depth as they'd want to say. So there's a lot we could say about this, and John will have plenty to say about this as well. We talked about The Eye of the Beholder. The Eye of the Beholder is Lydia's third book, which is about the Gospel of John. What's interesting there, the primary opponents in that book are highly evangelical scholars. So it's Craig Kuhner, it's Craig Evans, it's Michael Licona. The kinds of people, they do quote bart-ehrman occasionally, and they make the occasional other reference, but it's mostly debates, it's blog posts, it's the book Jesus Interrupted. So who are the kinds of opponents that they're looking for? Are they looking for the major figures in Johannine, which is the scholarship on John from the 20th century? They look at Raymond Brown's commentary on the Gospel of John. They look at Wayne Meek's work on Christology, another very prominent scholar. They look at other major Johannine scholars. No, there's none of them. Or another example of this, they talk about, there's a comment in Testimonies to the Truth. Or maybe it's the other one, maybe it's the Eye of the Beholder, where it talks about the criteria of authenticity. So the criteria of authenticity are something that some historical Jesus scholars have used to say this is something that this is a passage that seems more reliable, this is one that seems less reliable. And they make a comment and say scholars just accept this blindly, basically. And scholars kind of, whenever they talk about the Gospels, they'll make a reference to the criteria of authenticity. What's amazing about this kind of comment is that the last 10 years have seen a huge amount of discussion about the criteria of authenticity and whether they are good or not. There's a book called Jesus and the Demise of Authenticity. There's Dale Allison has an extremely lengthy, has like multiple critiques in his book Constructing Jesus. There's so much discussion of this topic, and it's not all positive. It's often to say these are crude tools and we can't necessarily use them, and there are other things that we might have to point to instead. So it's really there's a remarkable amount of a lack of engagement here. I mean, again, kind of one final example. Which of the major figures in the kind of quest for the historical Jesus have the McGrews engaged in detail in the last 100 years? So Helen Bond, who's a scholar that John knows well, has a book called The Historical Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed. And she goes through 10 of the most prominent historical Jesus scholars at the beginning. So she talks about Richard Horsley or James Dunn or Dale Allison or J.P. Meyer, E.P. Sanders. So which of these scholars have been engaged in detail? If we are saying that this is a pathologized field, which of these have they read and engaged in detail? And the answer is zero. The answer is absolutely none, that they have engaged in any sort of significant detail. I don't think it's reasonable to say that they've engaged Dale Allison in any significant detail. So I think this is incredibly notable. When they are saying that they have engaged this field in detail, there is much more that we could say about the kinds of engagement that they have. But if you want to say that a field is terrible and that it doesn't know what it talks about, the minimal thing that you should be doing before that is engaging it in a huge amount of detail. I just don't think that has been done so far.
Well, I've got an example of that, and after this, I'd like to move on to undesigned coincidence. But I've got a bit of an example of exactly what you're talking about here. I presented to Jonathan McLatchie, who you've said is part of this sort of movement, if you're going to speak like that, the whole thing of mark-goodacre and I think somebody Golding, what you call gospel fatigue or editorial fatigue. It's a more relatively recent compared with the 100 or so years of synoptic problem studies. Now, again, this synoptic problem, or puzzle, as some people like to call it, is the definite interrelationship between the Gospels. So it's basically, if there's any consensus at all in mainstream scholarship, it's that Matthew and Luke actually had a copy of Mark in front, and they were editing it and redacting it, copying it verbatim in chunks, and then changing it in their own way, doing their own things to it to sort of, in a sense, rewrite it in a way that they wanted to for theological reasons. And so an example of editorial fatigue is another sort of way of sort of showing this, but there's a mountain of evidence anyway. But here's one example of what's called editorial fatigue. Okay, Luke actually changes locations sometimes. One of his particular things is changing locations, like he has all of the resurrection appearances all happen in Jerusalem and they stay there. Mark and Matthew have it in Galilee, and they say nothing about Jerusalem, and Luke is all Jerusalem. So Luke does this. He relocates things for his own purposes. He does this with the feeding of the 5,000. This will come up later in what we call undesigned coincidences, and we talked about that with Jonathan McLatchie in one of our previous episodes. But editorial fatigue really stands in contrast to that view of the relationship between the Gospels. And one classic example is the feeding of the 5,000. And what Luke does is he actually sets the feeding of the 5,000 into the town, as it says, sometimes city in some versions, the town of Bethsaida. Now, it's interesting. Not only does he change the location from Mark, he actually says nothing about the getting in a boat and going along the coast of the Sea of Galilee and all of that sort of boat and coastal stuff, which is clearly there in Mark. But he has it in the town of Bethsaida. But he's clearly copying the story from Mark, because when it comes to the disciples ask Jesus the question, basically in Mark, where should we get all the food? Should we go into the towns and the villages and look into the shops there and get some food? Jesus says no and does the miracle. Luke actually copies largely the same wording, very similar wording about this desolate place that they're in and that they need to go into the towns and the villages and to connect their food. But he's already started the story in Bethsaida, which is a town, basically, a place with food and shops and things that you would have. So what the editorial fatigue people say is that he relocated it for his own purposes, but then he still copied chunks of the song of the story, and it's like a continuity error that's spotted later with very, very critical reading. And when you read it, I found it very persuasive, because it sounds like they're in a desolate place now and not in Bethsaida, not in a town where you could buy food. And but Mark was consistent. They were probably miles away from anywhere to get the food. And so it makes sense in Mark. It doesn't make sense because Luke has changed the location. So there's an example of editorial fatigue, and it stands on all fours against what we will later talk about with the McGrews as undesigned coincidences, and is another way of looking at that relationship. But editorial fatigue is basically building upon the idea that the authors of Matthew and Luke and John actually knew the gospel, knew each other. there was a relationship, and the later ones copied from the other ones, if you like. And so that builds upon modern scholarship. Undesigned coincidences, as we'll talk about, actually is pre all of that modern scholarship, and it kind of sets it aside or kind of ignores it or doesn't really talk about it.
One of the things that I've seen, the sort of the rhetorical strategies of the McGrews is to champion a kind of common sense approach.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that editorial fatigue is just a common sense thing. I mean, it's really, really difficult to write something in the ancient world. It takes sort of numerous scrolls, and usually there are people, who would be helping you out with the task and such. And so it makes sense that, in a number of places, Luke or Matthew is going to copy something and then maybe just fail to get everything straight. And the important thing here is that when Goodacre does that study and he says there's editorial fatigue, he's not trying to debunk an undesigned coincidence or anything like that.
No.
Rather, he's just doing the work of a scholar.
Yeah.
And this might be the same for example, the study of the oral tradition behind the Gospels. So it's generally recognized that, there is this black box before the first Gospel was written in 70 AD. And there is this oral culture in which sayings and stories of Jesus are being passed down. And there's this question, okay, how do we actually explain that process given the data we do have? How do we sort of explain back to see what that process would have looked like? And we come up with explanations. And so when I point to, for example, in my article, editorial fatigue or oral tradition as an explanation for some of the data we find in the Gospels, I'm not doing so. Or rather, as an explanation for the undesigned coincidences, I'm drawing on a field that is trying to explain features of the Gospels as a whole. As a whole, yes, I'm not trying to, as I think the McGrews are doing. I'm not going into the text to try and find something to debunk it. I'm just using the models that have already been created and have stood the test of scholarship on the whole, looking at the whole Gospels. And I'm seeing whether they have any sort of bearing as an alternative explanation to things like undesigned coincidences.
Yeah, and so in effect, another way to put that, John, is that in you hypothesizing with the to try and explain the data, you're not at war. Whereas
No.
the McGrewvians, if you like, are already taking that stuff. Well, you're at war then, obviously, because if you've got fatigue going on, then that's not what got, so you can see that. Okay, let's lead in then to an explanation. People are probably listening to this, undesigned what? So if one of you can just say that, because the big thing I heard about the McGrews right at the beginning was this subject. It was the subject called undesigned coincidence. So one of you, what is it?
Yeah, let's go back to the coffee shop.
Let's go back to the coffee shop. So the coffee example, to sort of follow up from earlier, in that Lydia McGrew gives in Hidden in Plain View, is that two friends are relating to you something they've heard about something they've had in their coffee catch-up. And apparently one of them made a third friend made a kind of confession. And you want to know, is this actually true? Or are these people just making up this story about a supposed and alleged confession? Well, what if one of the friends independently says to you that it had been unusually busy in the coffee shop, and another friend just casually mentions that they spilt their coffee that day in the conversation? Well, these details sort of casually dovetail. They go together quite well, because if it was unusually busy, we would also have an explanation for why the person spilt their coffee. The big question, of course, is whether the Gospels are like this, whether the Gospels are like two independent witnesses, or whether something else is going on. And I think one of the reasons why McGrew's book seems so compelling at first is because, as she says, she actually sets, quote, aside the apparatus of critical scholarship when she is presenting her argument. So she gives this a test run, and she doesn't actually sort of explain, it doesn't test it against other theories of the gospel origins, which are actually sort of produced in mainstream gospel research.
Can I jump in there?
Sorry.
Francis,
Yeah,
you go first.
Yeah,
Well,
go on,
I was just going to say, I can speak as someone who is an atheist, who is not a biblical scholar. When I heard somebody explaining undesigned coincidences, I did find that impressive. I thought, wow, that is a really good point. The example was of the feeding of the 5,000 at Bethsaida, and that Jesus asks Philip to go and take the money. I think I've got that right. And I thought, wow, that's right. That you know, why would it be like that? That's a pretty good argument. So you know, it definitely impressed me.
Yeah.
I think
Was-
it's just to go on the
Sorry.
history of this. It's the history of it though is with the guy I think primarily called William Paley, which was prior to the synoptic discussions and scholarship. And wouldn't it would make a lot more sense back then. But when you have just discussed, the outline you gave, John, on the interrelationship, if you told somebody there's two distinct or four distinct eyewitness testimonies here and they interlocked in this way, that's impressive. But if you said one of them actually copied the other person's story word for word 90%, I would have a question about their form of interlocking in the undesigned coincidence way. Do you see the point that I'm trying to make? I would go, oh, so he knew him. So he actually read that story. He's got it he's actually copying it. So that to me is a little bit of a blow against the assumptions of undesigned coincidence.
So how did you sort of unpack it, John?
Well, I should just say, just on that apologies, I'm very tired today and sort of mentally gone. But what were you just saying, Andy?
No,
Indeed.
Yeah.
Oh yes, you made the point. Maybe we can cut that out. You made the point that the Gospels are copying one another. So this doesn't look like the kind of like independent, the witness of the two people in the coffee shop and such, the independent witness to their friends. I suppose they would say that what we actually have going on here is that later eyewitnesses are contributing, or people who know eyewitnesses are contributing their testimony. So that actually explains why we do find these undesigned coincidences and so on. I think one of the immediate problems to this is that we know that in the ancient world, it's very common to copy other people's texts and not do that, or copy other people's texts and have a particular agenda in making the alterations. So redaction criticism is the study of the way that these alterations are made. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not intentional. So in the case of editorial fatigue, there just seems to be a mistake that's been made. In that example you just gave, Francis, you talked about how they turn to Philip and Jesus asks him in John's Gospel where to find bread. And elsewhere, in a completely unrelated place, we are told that Philip came from Bethsaida. So what's going on here? Because in Luke's Gospel, we're not told any of that stuff about Philip, but we are told that the feeding of the 5,000 took place in Bethsaida. So this seems to be a remarkable undesigned coincidence until we realize that the earliest account does not take place in Bethsaida, in Mark's Gospel. Rather, it takes place somewhere completely differently. It's only in Luke that we find it take place in Bethsaida. Actually, I wonder whether Matthew is in agreement there. The later text is in Bethsaida, but Luke's hand, his editorial fatigue, is betrayed when he resets the feeding in a city, but then copies Mark in describing the surroundings as a desolate place. So it does seem here that when we take that angle of this isn't actually Philip's. This isn't actually a sort of remarkable coincidence here. This is actually this isn't even Luke knowing it's from Bethsaida. Luke has just made a little mistake here, and that's why. Well, but you might say, well, why Philip? Why not Philip? It could be. I mean, John seems to take an interest in Philip later. And we also know that various other stories were told about Philip. So this could just be one of those stories where John sees fit to sort of name a particular character, and that's how we would explain the fact that Jesus has turned to Philip.
Yeah. I think it's useful just to situate this. So in terms of what the McGrews, I think we kind of have to remember. So what are the McGrews trying to do? The McGrews want to say the Gospels are as reliable as you possibly could hope for any ancient document that we have. That is the basis of a resurrection argument. That's the basis of kind of prophetic argument. So when they do this, they want to say the data we have in favor of reliability is as good as you could hope. And that undesigned coincidences are a great example of this. They also want to say the evidence that we have against the Gospels is super, super weak. So I think there are like real problems on both sides of this, and we can come to the kind of evidence against in a bit. I think in terms of the evidence for the Gospels, I think the critical problem that I think John really identifies in great detail in his article is that you have to do a lot more work when you want to say that these are definitely undesigned coincidences. So John gives a kind of a range of examples in his articles of where something looks like it might be an undesigned coincidence. Actually, maybe there's just another explanation. So it might be it's the processes of oral tradition and how things kind of were transmitted back through history. It might be it's the processes of redaction and the processes of editing things, and it's other things. Now, we have really good reasons, and there's a lot of scholarship which is used to justify that these kind of points might be some things that might be the reasons that we explain the Gospels in this way. There's a lot of work, and you have to engage that. You can't just set aside the apparatus of critical scholarship. You have to do the detailed work of engaging it. But that hasn't been done. Like it has not been done. There is a little bit of pushback. There's kind of a Jonathan McLatchie pushback to John's article, and I think there'd be more we could say about that. I think the critical point is that when you put evidence in favor, you have to do a lot more work to engage quite a detailed literature. It's an enormous literature on the historical Jesus, and it's really hard to know what's going on sometimes. And so if you want to make this kind of argument, you have to do that. And that just hasn't been done. So there is no sifting of the positive evidence that we have. I think that's the really critical problem. So I don't think John would actually say, and John can correct me, I don't think John really holds to a specific explanation that he gives in some of the cases. It may be that that's the explanation. That's a kind of a possible explanation that we have for why this goes on. But it's really hard to know what's going on. There are 10 reasons the grass could be green in the feeding of the 5,000 parables. I read scholars, I'll find 10 really plausible sounding answers. But because it's really hard to know what's going on and ancient history is really hard, that's what makes this really hard. So, yeah.
Can I jump in here? I'm really keen to jump in.
Yeah.
Firstly, just as an aside, episode 29 is the one to look back where we went in detail on this. And we'll put that in the notes. The other thing I want to say is harping back to Bayes' theorem, because I want to come back to it because it is Tim McGrew's big thing, and it's very simple. It has these three concepts that we've been talking about. The first one is this priors, how likely your hypothesis is before you even look at the evidence. The second is the how good a fit is between your hypothesis, in this case that the Gospels are highly reliable and accurate, how good that fits with the evidence, and that's where they're pushing the undesigned coincidences. And then the third, there's only three, and the third one is how good a fit there is between the negation, the hypothesis you're pushing, and the evidence. And so that's what we're saying is the whole here. There's only three things. Two are fine. The third one, they're just missing completely. And yet, if they're good Bayesian Bayesian epistemologists, they really should be covering all three of the concepts that Bayes is just the heart of Bayes.
Yeah. So so what you're saying basically is Bayesianism one of the key aspects is to look at different hypotheses. So you want to say, what are the alternatives is basically the kind of layman's understanding of what Bayesianism is. And so if you want to say, this is evidence for our hypothesis over others, you have to evaluate the best alternative hypotheses. And the McGrews haven't done that, and so that's not very good Bayesianism. Is that?
Here's a super easy example. You have a crime. We have a murder, and you have a murder weapon, and the fingerprints of the chief suspect are all over the knife, and the blood of the victims on the knife. So, well, isn't that just a perfect fit for him being the murderer? But if you find that the murder took place in a kitchen, his kitchen, the kitchen of the suspect, then you've got an alternative explanation for how the fingerprints are on the knife.
Yes, precisely. And to go back to that idea of, or to apply that maybe to the feeding of the 5,000 story, it may seem like when John mentions barley loaves, that this is a sort of, and this signals that it's around the time of Passover, when the harvest was, and that this sort of harmonizes beautifully with Mark's gospel, which says that many were coming and going and such. So that looks really good. That looks like a sort of an undesigned coincidence. But what if you know, firstly, that John's gospel knows Mark's gospel, which is what many scholars would argue that the similarities are substantial enough to sort of guarantee that conclusion, or at least make that conclusion quite likely. Or what if you knew that the feeding of the 5,000 story actually looks extremely similar in its literary structure to 2 Kings 4, in which Elijah feeds 100 people, in which Elijah turns to a servant, and they have a conversation with a servant about how the people are going to be fed. That story uses the Greek words in its Greek translation, artus krithinus, which is the barley loaves, which is what John also uses. So, and you also know that there is a common literary practice in the ancient world in which people make this kind of updating of earlier stories, or weave their own stories using scriptural precedents. So once you know those sorts of things, what seems at first, and also that it's not the only place that Mark's gospel, which is quite chronologically imprecise, mentions that there were many coming and going. Once you have that data in your background, then this doesn't seem to be like this subtle corroboration between John and Mark. It actually seems like there are lots of other things going on. And I think this is the really sad thing about kind of McGrewvianism in terms of reading the Gospels, is that you actually miss lots of things that are going on in the text that the text wants to teach to us. So, for example, if you just take Mark's incidental note that the grass was green in the feeding of the 5,000, you might, and it's just a sort of historical account, you might miss the fact that Ezekiel talks about when the Messiah comes, that there is going to be sort of an abundance of fertility in the land. And you're going to miss those kind of allusions to King David as sort of a shepherd figure, and those shepherding images, which actually the text is really explicit about about early on. So the text actually, I think Mark's account begins by saying that Jesus had compassion, like a shepherd does on his sheep for the crowds. So these are theological interests that the writers want to convey to us. And the same for John. The reason why sort of John has 3 Passovers is because he has Jesus fulfilling a whole chronology of Jewish institutions throughout his gospel. And you miss that theological meaning if it's all just about this being an eyewitness text.
I think this is critical, because I think what John, So John said earlier on, what the McGrews say is they are advancing a maximal data approach. So that they say that we are coming to this, and they make a comment in the Black Hole Companion piece where they're saying we're treating this as we would treat any secular historical document. And we are considering all the data, and we are providing that in an unbiased way to you. And the result of that is we get to conservative Christianity. Amazing. What a wonderful thing. What we're saying is that maximal data is absolutely not what is going on here. That there's a nice comment in the one podcast commenting on the McGrews talking about my data versus your data. So we are showing all the data on one side, and we are saying, and we're not really sifting it. There's no sifting going on. We're just saying, yeah, if this supports the reliability of the Gospels, it can come on through. Any data against reliability, that is completely dismissed. So anything about mimesis, anything about contradictions, anything about editorial fatigue, there is an extremely low bar, and you would never accept any of this. And that, I think that, again, it links back to, this comes from the commitment. So when you have these strong conservative commitments, then you're not going to accept any data against it. So you're always going to be incredibly skeptical of harmonization. Not of harmonization or a contradiction. You're always going to be extremely skeptical of mimesis. Always going to be skeptical that, you're always going to say, yeah, memory, it can be really reliable. And so sure, there can be special instances where memory is really reliable, and not accept the kind of psychological literature that says that memory studies, that memory is frequently mistaken. So I think that would be where what John is pointing to is data. Of course, that's data, and we have to accept it in the thing, and that will form our view of the Gospels.
And can I just say a few things there on just a few clarifying points, at least on mimesis, because it seems like in the McGrewvian world, there has been this sort of rallying cry against Dennis MacDonald, who's talked about the imitation of Homeric epic in the Gospels and Acts, I think particularly the Gospel of Mark and Acts. And, I do think this is a little bit of a red herring, because not many people take this seriously. I think there is mimesis and imitation in the Gospels, but I'm referring principally to the way in which the Jewish scriptures are being used. So I think that's the primary backdrop, so, and also Jewish tradition is imitation. Is when you take a text and you use it as the basis for a new text. So like the feeding of the 5,000 being an update of that story in 2 Kings, where Elisha feeds 100 people with fewer loaves and such. So,
and maybe splitting one story into 2. So you got the 4,000 and the 5,000. That's another argument as well. Isn't it?
That's a really interesting point, because the 4,000 seems to be on almost a Gentile conversion story, and sort of takes place in a Gentile area, sort of showing Jesus' mission to the Gentiles as well as the Jews. But it lacks verisimilitude. It lacks kind of this air of historical plausibility, because it's a little bit like a pantomime where the disciples sort of say, what are we going to do here? And then Jesus goes, and then Jesus is like, don't you get it? And what they're supposed to get is that he is the Messiah. But I want to say another thing, which is that it seems like people go one way but not the other on this. There's a kind of asymmetry in the way that people will saturate themselves in biblical scholarship and move away from the more conservative position. But I rarely see that movement the other way. Like, for example, I talked to you about my story, how I was at Nottingham and how I was still sort of fixed in this harmonization. But I just found a richer way of engaging with the scriptures, which was to take account of literary theory, redaction, narrative criticism, paying attention to their distinctive theology, paying attention to the literary background of ancient biography and so on. And I just found that to be a richer way. And, I still have, a fairly, vibrant faith. I've sort of come out the other side, and I'm still believing and so on. So I don't think, which is just to say, I don't think you need to go down this direction, and I don't think many people are won over by it, which is reflected in the fact that they are not. They're not, as far as I'm aware, they're not trying to publish their work in mainstream journals and persuade an agnostic, an atheist, a Jewish, Muslim audience of their claims. They're actually writing it with small publishing companies, which are not peer reviewed. And then the fleet of familiar names from Christian apologetics is being brought in to support this. And I, apart from Craig Blomberg, I'm not sure if any of those are New Testament critics. So I think that also says something about, what they're trying to do here, which is, I don't know. I mean, if they are trying to persuade, the masses of skeptics, why are they engaging in this way? It seems a strange thing to do.
Yeah.
Sounds very similar to the Case for Christ book. Case for Christ is similar in the way.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So it's presented as though, I believe that Strobel is going around and talking to all of these, esteemed scholars at universities and so on. But then you find out that, the scholars have been selected particularly from, theological seminaries and so on. And it's a real bugbear I have with the apologetics world, really, because there's such a great richness of spiritual, theological, biblical reflection that we could be drawing on as Christians. And yet we go always to the evidentialists and those who are sort of out to prove a point.
I will never understand why Lee Strobel's book has such a high profile amongst apologists. I mean, it's just awful. It's just an awful book.
Yeah.
Its arguments are terrible. And, I think you don't need to be particularly knowledgeable reading it to see that he was throwing all these softball questions that, he was someone who was already convinced by the time he went to speak to them. But anyway,
by the time he went,
that's
marketed like he was an atheist going around doing it, but actually it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I do really object to what I think is...
But similar to the...
I do feel it's dishonesty. I mean, I'm not saying, the McGrews are dishonest. I did think Lee Strobel's book was dishonest.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a digression.
On John's point on mimesis, just to go back to your 3 steps, John gives this explanation of the feeding of the 5,000, talks about 2 Kings 4, 42 to 44. So McLatchie did respond to this, interestingly. So there is a response article, and McLatchie accepts the link, which is interesting. So he says, actually, it does seem quite similar. But what he says is that God could have orchestrated the events so that they just looked quite similar. So he could have done the miracle. What's to object to about this? Now, I think we have to remember they're claiming to be unbiased historians here. They're just unbiased historians, and they are looking at the evidence in an unbiased way. If we are unbiased historians, we know that this kind of thing goes on. So we know that mimesis takes place in Ovid. Ovid does this in the Metamorphoses, and he looks at we know that this happens in the Book of Jubilees. We know that the Book of Jubilees does lots of rewriting of the Book of Genesis. We know that this happens across Second Temple Jewish literature. It happens all the time. So when we come to this with literary appreciation of the text, we come to this as historians and we look at wider scholarship. Our first explanation is not going to be the one that says, oh yeah, this looks like it happened because just God orchestrated in our way. That's not the historical explanation. We're not treating this like a secular text anymore. We're letting our existing commitments drive our scholarship as a result. And it runs through everything we just said. So it runs through the kind of Lee Strobel stuff. It runs through everything else. We are just letting existing commitments drive it, and it's not acceptable. So,
just a rider on that, Josh. I'm sure I mentioned this to Jonathan about the new Matthew making Jesus the new Moses. But wouldn't that argue, if he did accept that, wouldn't it mean that that's the same argument that they'd make, that actually Jesus went around literally to do this, that, and the other, so that people would go, I see, you're enacting Moses kind of figure here, rather than a literary put together of the material, as opposed to Mark, who didn't do that.
Right. I mean, I think you'd have to do a mixture, again, so that your existing commitments drive your conclusion here. So sometimes they'll accept the link and sometimes they won't. And you then either explain it away in whichever way. And it's all piecemeal. There's no unified criteria that's going to link your answer together. It's just, we're going to go to the conservative end of possible is a nice phrase that I heard on it. And so you'll explain it away in some way. So maybe it does look like Moses, maybe it doesn't, but either way, we're going to find a conservative explanation here.
Right.
Okay. And so, yeah, that would be my take.
That's how all unbiased historians work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Interesting.
I had a nice point on McLatchie to mention, which is one of the things I think you always find with McGrewvians. So this is why I think everything's driven by existing commitments. You're never surprised by a McGrewvian conclusion. You always come out. It's always the kind of thing you expect. So it's not intellectual inquiry where you might go somewhere or somewhere else. It's always oh, Jonathan McLatchie's written a 10,000 word blog post on the book on the authorship of Daniel. I wonder what he thinks about Daniel. Exactly. You kind of read it. Oh, I read it. He comes out and Daniel was written in, it's a 6th century document. Surprise, surprise. Lydia has now read Fatigue in the Synoptics by Mark-Goodacre. Guess what? She hates it. She thinks it's a load of crap. No surprises there. Like if anything you read, it's always directed to a certain conclusion. Like, so it's always the existing commitments are there, and they're going to do some work, and they're going to find the conservative explanations, and lo and behold,
Young Earth is Ken Ham all over again.
Yes,
you have to come to the conclusion. Whereas your own journey, Josh, has shown, in fact, through not necessarily wanting it, but you've looked at stuff, engaged with this, engaged with that, and go back and forth. Probably felt like battered sometimes, to and fro, and then finally going, okay, this is really where it's going. That shows that that's a trait that was in me. That's a trait that's in you and in John, but not in Jonathan McLatchie or them. Because have they come forward and said, look, we used to say this, we've now actually done a lot of research, and to be honest, we're now saying this. Is there anything like that?
This is why I think, in terms of changing people's minds, what you need to do is not attack the elephant, so to speak, but you attack the rider. You attack the heart, the intuition. Because if I feel comfortable saying, and maybe I just use a clear example in the Gospels where, there's no way I can reconcile this thing, or it just looks like this is probably a story. Because people tell stories. If I go to a few of those and I show that no damage has been done here to like an Orthodox Christian belief, if I can do that, then there is some budging that can be done elsewhere. But the reason why there is no room for maneuver with the McGrews is because they are totally wedded to an evidentialist epistemology and therefore a maximal data approach. That is why there will be no budging ever, because they need to defend that at all costs, which to me is really odd, because on a spiritual level, the resurrection was something that the earliest disciples were wrestling with. It wasn't obvious to them if we read Mark. Sorry, if we read Mark doesn't have anything. If we read Matthew, and also if we read Luke, where it is in the breaking of bread that they recognize Christ. Whoa! So it's in a ritual activity that they realize that Jesus was risen from the dead. So I mean, that sounds also a lot like communion to me. So it's really strange that it's only now that we can realize it's just this provable thing, whereas for the earliest disciples it was actually very subjective what was going on.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit like what I've always said, in the sense that when Philip in the disciple what was it in the gospel is explaining the scriptures or something, and you can just imagine the McGrews or somebody would say, now let me tell you about the cosmological argument. Do you know what I mean? to in a first century Bible story, it's just not where their mind was, is it? In terms of the way the stories are, it's not like, well, it's obvious that like one of the disciples is saying, well, where does you're borrowing from our faith, because where does morality come from? You can't imagine that story in the Bible. That's later modern ways of arguing. I understand the arguments, but
can I just say on the mimesis thing that to reiterate a point that Josh made earlier, we're not saying that this is necessarily the thing that happened. As in, we're not even saying this was just fabricated from nothing, and that there was and that they just thought about two kings for one day, and they just wrote this story. It could be that there was a kernel, or there was a historical event. We certainly know that Jesus went around teaching crowds. I don't think that's like a controversial historical point. We also know that Jesus was a healer, that this is something that Jesus was known as a healer, and that this is, in every strata, I think, of the early tradition. Maybe apart from Paul, actually, but I mean, there's lots to talk about Paul. And so, although I actually, that's for another time, but I think Paul might have known Q. I think there are some interesting arguments there. And if he did, then he would have also known that Jesus was a healer. So there are aspects to this story which make it really plausible for why Jesus could have been remembered in both Elisha and Moses-like frames, what social memory theorists called frames, sort of early on. And so we're not just necessarily suggesting, I mean, it goes back to that point of Dale Allison, that modesty becomes us. It's really painful that we don't have more, and we can't say more, but we're not necessarily saying that this is a pure invention from nothing, but we are saying that some mimesis has gone on.
I think the modesty becomes us point is critical. That this is really hard. Historical Jesus research is really hard because the Gospels are our memory. John and I absolutely accept that they are memory, but they are memory mixed with so much else. There's a nice quote from Dale where he talks about they're intertextually fertile, they're theologically resonant, they're rhetorically powerful. There's just so much going on here, and it's when we have to when we don't set aside the apparatus of critical scholarship, it's really hard, and we don't know, and sometimes we just don't know. So like when we have this kind of thing, it raises our eyebrows, and so we can't. It's too easy to the maximal data approach is just too easy, and it means that we stop much too early, and we're not doing the hard work that we have to.
So is the position that you're saying that the McGrews could be right? It's not impossible that they're right, but there just isn't enough evidence for them to be claiming with confidence that they are right.
Correct. I think it's that, and that they haven't done the hard work of, if there are 10 hypotheses on the table with everything in New Testament studies to explain what we're doing here, then you have to compare against those other hypotheses, and you have to do the hard work of engaging this, and these things have independent justification, as we said. So there are good reasons to say that mimesis of the Hebrew Bible is going on. There are good reasons to say that the Gospels are editing each other. There's lots of hard work which goes in to saying that. There's lots of hard work that goes into saying there are Greco-Roman parallels. That's the whole point of Robin Walsh, or if you look at Andrew Lincoln's work. There's so much going on here, and we have to do that work. Like, we can't avoid it. And if we avoid it, then we're not doing proper scholarship. So
I'd love to. Another point, know more about what you think about Robin Faith Walsh. It's moving with slightly newer ideas as well these days. But anyway,
I haven't done all the work to engage her, but it's certainly interesting. The stuff that I read in Andrew Lincoln's book on the virgin birth was very interesting. So that certainly showed that this was plausible to me. And John will know more than me, but yes.
Well, that's been absolutely brilliant. I mean, thank both of you so much for coming on and the work you've done on this, and sharing the papers with us, which we'll be able to put in the show notes. I mean, I found it fascinating. And
some critical places to go, critiques of McGrew's work and approach.
Yeah, there's much more we could say, and maybe we can come back and do a part two, but let's see. But certainly the best critiques so far. John's piece on undesigned coincidences is rather fabulous, I have to say. There was a 3.5-hour podcast done by Matthew Harkey, the amateur etchology and the non-alchemist, last year, called The McGrew Failure. It's a little bit long, but it's a fantastic podcast. I think 3.5 hours, you need to watch that at 2x or 3x to really get through it. But there's lots of great material in there.
But also, I was just going to say, even for especially, evangelical listeners might be interested in a book called, I think it's The Gospel of the Lord by Michael Bird, who's also written a kind of, I think, a evangelical systematic theology. And the reason I say that is because that if you accept the dating of the Gospels, if according to critical scholars, if you accept, or well, I should just say sort of, mainstream scholars, or if you accept the authorship of the Gospels, that these were sort of originally anonymous texts, and that these names got attached to them later, and maybe there is some connection with earlier traditions, but that is all to be thoroughly debated. If you accept that, then you are already at odds with the McGrews. That's all you really need is to be on a very different footing, is a really basic, even an evangelical introduction to New Testament studies.
I'd give a final recommendation from me, was it a recommendation that John made to me early in our chats, is a book by Dale Allison called The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus, which is it's just 100 pages. It's kind of barely 140 pages. What I think it gives you is the point that we've kind of made throughout this podcast, is that there's a lot of scholarship and it's really hard. It's really hard to know what's going on, because there's so much going on. And Dale Allison is an incredible writer. His prose is unbelievable. His amount of reading is completely ridiculous. And it's a really nice book. It's a really good introduction to, and it's critical of the field. It's not just, it doesn't take the field at face value, and it absolutely accepts that this is a diverse and difficult field, but it is respectful to New Testament scholarship, because he knows what is going on, and it presents the kind of mixed view that we have presented so far of gospel reliability, that we both think is more plausible.
And the links I would do is that on Myth Vision, there's an episode there where there's a takedown of undesigned coincidences with a scholar that Derek on that channel has. So that's a channel called Myth Vision on YouTube. If you just typed in undesigned coincidences, that would come up. And also the seemingly arch enemy here, but I quite like him sometimes, Richard Carrier's done a takedown of undesigned coincidence. He's done an article. I don't know if any of you read that one. But
I tend to stay away from Carrier.
Yeah, I tend to say, well, it was a good artitle. It was a good article.
Sure.
Take it so it's interesting from one side to the other in that realm. Anyway, so we've stuck to time here, and it's been an amazing thing. Okay,
it's always a real pleasure to talk to you. So
it's been amazing. I was going to call you both JJ or J John. J John, if you're familiar with that guy. Okay, so until next time, we will have both of you back at some point, continuing some discussions, which will be great as and when we can organize it. But until then, and until the next time, I have been Andrew, your host.
I've been Francis.
I've been John.
And I've been Josh. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.